Welcome back. Augustus had initiated the third phase of Roman history, the Empire, and he had provided a model for how it would be organized. Tiberius, his successor, then kept things running relatively smoothly. This lecture will trace the fortunes of the Roman Empire over the next 2 centuries. And the rulers of this era will feature both Rome's wisest and most conscientious emperors and several of its most notorious and really deranged tyrants. The next emperor to take the throne was one of the latter, a nephew of Tiberius known by the nickname Caligula, which meant literally little boots. And these were actual boots given to him as a young boy when he had accompanied his father on military campaigns, and he wore a miniature pair of legionary boots. Caligula was still very, very young when he became emperor, and he rapidly embarked on what we might call a reign of terror and also of profligate expenditure. And just to give you a sense of the sort of person he was, for entertainment, he liked to watch people being tortured to death. Whenever he kissed his wife, he would whisper in her ear, "You know, I could have this beautiful throat cut anytime I please." His favorite saying was, "Let everybody hate me, so long as they fear me." And finally, how do you think the ruler of the known world spent his idle free time? Well, at least according to one source, he would spend hours every day in front of a mirror practicing making horrible and disgusting faces. Now, he did share one thing in common with the average Roman. He was a fan of horse and chariot racing. And he had a favorite horse, which he named Incitatus. It translates literally to something like speedy. Caligula had a special marble stable built for Incitatus, and on race days he would station troops all around the area with orders to kill anyone who made noise, just to make sure that Incitatus got a good night's rest. And it was rumored that Caligula planned to have Incitatus, his horse, appointed to the consulship. Well, after about 4 years of these sorts of actions, Caligula was murdered by the commanders of his own bodyguard, who finally just got fed up with his behavior. Caligula, though, is the first disastrous result of Augustus's decision to base succession on the principle of heredity. But he won't be the last. There was no obvious successor after the murder of Caligula. And for a while, the Roman Senate debated, what do we do now? Well, while they were dithering, the Praetorian guardsmen, these were the emperor's bodyguards, they were looting the palace. And in the process of doing so, they saw some feet sticking out from under a curtain. And when they pulled back the curtain, they discovered Caligula's uncle. He was a man named Claudius. And despite his close kinship to the emperor, Claudius had really never been taken seriously. He had a number of physical handicaps, he had a speech impediment, and people regarded him as dim-witted. Now, in reality, it looks like he actually had a fairly sharp intellect, though he had what we might call today social problems. And on the spur of the moment, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed this rather unlikely candidate emperor. And this little incident reveals what is really the new reality of power in the Roman Empire. And that is, whoever has the support of the army could be the emperor. Claudius had a lot of problems in his family life. He went through several different wives. He eventually wound up marrying his own niece and adopting her son. And Claudius did manage to rule a fairly long time. Among his other achievements was he constructed several important public works, such as a new harbor for Rome and a major aqueduct. And eventually he died in 54 AD, perhaps as a result of eating a bowl of poisoned mushrooms, which were provided by his wife/niece and his own stepson. Now, Claudius's stepson was a teenage boy known as Nero. And at least for a few years, while he was still under the influence of his tutors, which included the famous Stoic philosopher Seneca, Nero was a decent emperor. Soon, however, he turned against his mentors. He forced Seneca, the philosopher, to commit suicide, and he may perhaps even have gone insane. At the very least, we could say he lost touch with reality, and he embarked on yet another reign of terror and debauchery. In the course of this, Nero murdered almost every member of his family. So, in addition to his stepfather, he is thought to have murdered his brother, his aunt, his stepson, and finally, even his own mother. Although that proved to be a real challenge and resulted in an almost kind of a Monty Python-esque sequence of blundered assassination attempts. First, he tried on no less than 3 separate occasions to poison his mother. But knowing her son, she had foreseen these attempts, and so before every meal, she would drink antidotes. Thwarted in that strategy, Nero then presented her with a new bedroom, which was equipped with a special ceiling that would drop on her as she slept. But she was tipped off by one of the builders and evaded that trap. Next, he invited his mother out to a picnic on an island, and he had a special collapsible boat designed in an attempt to drown her. Well, just as planned, the boat fell apart in the water. But what do you know? Nero's mother could swim, and so she reached shore safely. Finally, in frustration, he simply had one of his servants murder her. Nero also, by the way, married his own stepsister, but eventually killed her too. Nero's idea of a fun pastime was to wander around the streets of Rome at night in disguise and basically mug random people. Sometimes he would even kill them and throw their bodies into the sewer. Nero did many other cruel things, but I think you get the picture by now. Ultimately, in 68 AD, there was a palace revolt against him, and he was killed by one of his own slaves. That first set of emperors, from Augustus through Nero, is collectively called the Julio-Claudians. And the death of Nero created an interesting moment of crisis. Augustus, the first emperor, had established the principle of succession as being that the throne would go to the nearest male relative. Well, Nero's rampages against his own family had been so thorough that there were no male Julio-Claudians left to take over. So the Romans had a dilemma. How do you select the next emperor? Well, in I suppose what is a tradition that goes all the way back to the foundation of the city in Romulus and Remus, the Romans solved that problem by having a civil war. And the year 69 AD was one of constant warfare among various rivals for the throne. In that 1 year, the Romans ran through no less than 4 emperors. But finally, a man named Vespasian from a family called the Flavians emerged as the permanent victor. He became emperor, he brought those civil wars to an end. And in a lot of ways, you can think of Vespasian as almost a second Augustus. He ruled wisely, he lived very modestly, and he built a number of public works. Vespasian also had a coarse sense of humor. We know that he liked making obscene jokes. Vespasian was pretty old by the time he took the throne, and he'd already had a long, distinguished career as an administrator in general. Vespasian, though, had a popular son named Titus, as well as a younger son named Domitian. Now, Titus had already successfully commanded some Roman armies himself. In fact, he had played a central role in suppressing a very famous revolt by the Jews. So when Vespasian died, there was a smooth transition to Titus, and everybody was happy because Titus showed a lot of promise. It was during the reign of Titus that the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, was built. It was also during the reign of Titus that Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Titus in general was regarded as a good and popular ruler, but unfortunately he died prematurely after only a couple years. That meant the throne went to Vespasian's younger son, Domitian. And unfortunately, Domitian turned out to be more in the mold of Caligula and Nero. He did the usual things crazy emperors do. He put many senators to death. He enjoyed terrorizing them. One nice story about him is once he invited a number of senators to something he called the Feast of Death at the palace. And so he had the entire dining room draped in black cloth. He had black plates, black glasses, black silverware, and even black food. And each senator's place at the table was marked with a little miniature tombstone with their names carved onto them. And obviously the terrified senators were all sure that at the end of this meal they would all be murdered. But when the end of the night came, Domitian just sent them home, content just to have savored their fear. How do you think this ruler of the known world liked to spend his idle hours? Well, supposedly Domitian would spend several hours every day locked alone in a little room in the palace, catching flies and impaling them on pins. And that led to an actual Roman joke from this time that survives. One Roman asks another, "Who's with the emperor today?" And the reply is, "No one, not even a fly." Domitian was assassinated in 96 AD, and his death marked the end of the Flavian family of emperors. So that now takes us pretty much through the first century of the empire, the first 100 years. And by then, the institution of having an emperor was firmly established. There was still, though, the problem of succession. And this whole principle of choosing the emperor based on heredity had obviously resulted in a number of disastrous emperors. And even the Romans, who were always hesitant to change, realized that they couldn't afford to keep picking their emperors this way. The next series of emperors recognized that fact. And in what really is a fairly rare example of the Romans breaking with tradition, instead of picking the next emperor as from being the nearest blood relative, instead those emperors came up with an original idea. They selected the person who seemed best qualified for the job. Then they adopted that person as their son, and they became the next emperor. This would prove to be a wise policy, and it led to Rome enjoying what really was its most powerful and stable period. The next series of leaders who ruled roughly during the 2nd century AD became known as the Five Good Emperors. And that century, the 2nd century AD, is viewed as the high point of the Roman Empire. It's the time when it reached its greatest extent. It's a time when there was relative peace and prosperity among its inhabitants. And it was a time when the emperors themselves were wise and just rulers, generally speaking. The famous historian of Rome, Edward Gibbon, considered this time a golden age. And he once even called this era the happiest time in all of history. Well, that's probably overstating things a bit, but it was a good period for Rome. By that time, Rome had grown to encompass about 50 different provinces and about 50 million inhabitants. The empire stretched from Portugal in the west all the way to Mesopotamia in the east, and from Britain up in the north down to the Sahara Desert in the south. The Five Good Emperors are also sometimes called the Antonine Emperors, and that, like Julio-Claudian and Flavian, is a family name. The first of them really only ruled a short time, but it's with the second one that the series really got going, and his name was Trajan. And Trajan was notable for being the first emperor to come from the provinces. He was from a town in Spain. And so his accession to the throne illustrates really a shift in power from Italy to the provinces. And it also mirrors a change in the composition of the Senate that was happening at this time. Because as the decades went by, a higher and higher percentage of the members of the Senate were not actually Italians, but were citizens whose origins were in the provinces. And one of the keys to Rome's success and to its longevity as an empire was the way it was willing to incorporate and Romanize talented men from its provinces. And that's a theme that we'll come back to later. Trajan had already had a substantial distinguished career before he was selected as emperor. And in many ways, he earned the reputation of being the best emperor since Augustus. In his personal life, he was very sober. He was always very respectful to the Senate. He did have an interest in military conquests and in pushing out Rome's borders a bit more. So accordingly, he launched an invasion of a region known as Dacia. This was an area enclosed by a large bend of the Danube River. And you could almost see this war as a rational one, because by conquering Dacia, the frontier could be shortened and straightened. He also launched a war against the latest Mesopotamian-based empire, which was a group called the Parthians. And he won at least some temporary victories there. At one point, Mesopotamia itself actually became a province of the Roman Empire. And one of the benefits of the Dacian campaign was that he captured some rich gold mines. And Trajan used a lot of the income from those gold mines to build huge, elaborate public works, including a brand new harbor to serve the city of Rome. Also, right in the center of Rome, next to the old Roman Forum, he built a gigantic new complex which became known as the Forum of Trajan. The main enclosure of this was an area 600 by 1,000 feet in size, and it was entirely built of the finest imported exotic marbles and decorative stones. And right next to this was Trajan's Column, which depicted and commemorated his Dacian campaign. On one side of that column, he put a Latin library, and on the other side, he put a Greek library. And Trajan, in general, acquired the reputation of nearly being an ideal emperor. So one of the titles that he earned was Optimus Princeps, which means the best princeps. In later years, the Roman Senate would praise emperors that they regarded as good ones by using Trajan as a kind of yardstick to measure them against. So, for example, one standard acclamation that the Senate would shout at emperors was Felicior Augusto Melior Traiano. And that translates as luckier than Augustus, better than Trajan. And that sort of a comparative chant could also be used by the Senate to condemn emperors whom they hated. So, for example, after the death of an emperor, Commodus, who was another crazy emperor, the Senate celebrated by chanting this very memorable phrase, Saevior Domitiano imperior Nerone, which translates as crueler than Domitian, filthier than Nero. And that's a great insult. Trajan selected as his heir a man named Hadrian. And Hadrian was another very well-qualified choice. He also had had a long, respectable career before being adopted. Unlike Trajan, though, Hadrian did not embark on any new conquests. He was more a patron of the arts. And in particular, he loved Greek culture. He was an absolutely enthusiastic admirer of all things Greek. Hadrian's reign also illustrates one possible solution to the fact that the Roman Empire was simply growing too big to be effectively ruled by one man. Issues of control and communication during an era when technology was really quite low was a problem for all early empires. And that's a topic that we're going to examine more closely in an upcoming lecture. But think, how could an emperor at Rome really understand what was happening in a province far, far away? Well, Hadrian's response to this was to travel constantly. And he actually spent many years of his reign on a grand tour, visiting every province of the empire in turn. And his court was a mobile court, which traveled along with him. Hadrian had many mistresses as well, but the true, passionate love of his life was a young, beautiful, curly-haired Greek youth named Antinous. And Antinous went with Hadrian on all these travels until, tragically in Egypt, there was an accident and Antinous drowned in the Nile River. Hadrian was devastated by the loss of his favorite, and he had innumerable marble statues of Antinous made and distributed all over the empire. And because of the sheer number of these statues which were made, when you go to a museum today, they're actually one of the most common Roman statues that you might encounter. Hadrian also founded a city in his honor named, as you might expect, Antinoopolis. Back in Rome, Hadrian built some famous structures, including the Pantheon. Just outside of Rome, he built an enormous villa for himself in the countryside near the town of Tivoli. And in this villa, he built various rooms and sort of structures which reminded him of places that he had visited on his grand tour. And you can still go to the ruins of Hadrian's villa at Tivoli today and see the house that the emperor lived in. The next emperor, Antoninus Pius, was another sound choice. But he really didn't do anything special or remarkable. We can think of him more as a caretaker rather than an innovator. So he kept the empire running smoothly. His successor, however, was Marcus Aurelius, and he would turn out to be the last of the 5 good emperors. Marcus Aurelius is sometimes called the philosopher emperor, and that's because he was an adherent of the Stoic school of philosophy, like Zeno and Seneca earlier. And Marcus Aurelius even wrote a famous book, which is called the Meditations, in which he speculates about how do you lead a virtuous life. And he talks about how one must try to do your best always, even under difficult circumstances. Now, this was more than just kind of an abstract topic for Marcus Aurelius, because he himself had to endure various difficulties in his reign. He had to contend with a number of new external threats to the empire, especially some barbarian groups in the north. A new tribe, the Marcomanni, another group, the Sarmatians, both started to threaten Rome during his reign. Even more destructive, though, was an outbreak of plague that began in the east and spread throughout the empire and killed many, many people. Marcus Aurelius was the last of the 5 good emperors, because when it came time for him to select a successor, he looked around, tried to find the best qualified person, and, well, despite all his supposed wisdom as a philosopher, he foolishly decided that, what do you know, the best qualified person just happened to be his own son, Commodus. Well, you can probably predict how well this is going to turn out. Commodus became emperor in 180 AD, and so we regard the era of the 5 good emperors as having stretched from 96 to 180 AD. And in addition to being wise, the 5 good emperors also brought stability to the empire, since there were only 5 emperors over an 84-year stretch. But now we have to turn to Commodus. Very far from being the best qualified person, Commodus, in reality, was a spoiled child with delusions of godhood. In essence, he's another Caligula. Commodus also thought that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, and so he used to wander around the imperial palace dressed in a lion's skin like the Greek hero. Commodus also degraded the office of emperor by fighting in public as a gladiator in rigged contests. And Commodus also embarked on the, by now, standard course of terrorizing the Senate, engaging in debauchery, and spending too much money. Eventually, he was strangled in his bath. The next emperor was almost immediately murdered by the Praetorian Guard, and this led to one of the most shameful moments in all of Roman history. That murder had effectively left the Praetorian Guard in charge of Rome, and so they decided they would simply take advantage of this to make a quick buck. The Guard decided to stage an auction at which the item up for sale was nothing less than the office of emperor itself. And again, this incident, I think, clearly reveals the reality of power. It's the troops who can make or break an emperor. And in the next century, as more people realize that fact, more and more emperors will gain the throne by military force. Well, as for the auction, they held it, and a rich man named Didius Julianus offered the highest price to the Praetorian Guard. And he promised them 25,000 Roman sesterces per man. That's about the equivalent of 25 years' salary for an ordinary Roman legionary. Well, the Guard's response to this offer was, "Hail Didius, new emperor of Rome." And I hope he got his money's worth, because almost immediately he got murdered as well. Well, at this point, the legions and the provinces decided they should get in on the action as well. And separately, the legions posted in Syria, Britain, and the Danube each proclaimed their own governor as the new emperor. These three governors, or self-styled emperors with their respective armies, all then raced to Rome and fought it out in a big civil war. The one who eventually emerged the victor from all this was the governor from the Danube region, a man named Septimius Severus. Severus was the first of what we might call the soldier emperors. Sometimes books will call them the barracks emperors. And these are men who became emperor not by adoption or selection or any other thing, but because they simply could command the most troops. And as in this example, typically they're provincial governors of frontier provinces which faced dangerous barbarians. And so those provinces had been assigned large armies under the control of the governor. Severus was also from the town of Leptis Magna in North Africa. And so he represents the first African emperor. And again, that shows how power was shifting out to the provinces. He actually wasn't that bad an emperor. He stabilized the situation, and he ruled, I suppose, effectively, if a little bit harshly, from 193 to 211 AD. And he really was a military man, so he was very practical. And his deathbed advice to his sons, I think, summarizes his entire philosophy. He said to them, "Enrich the soldiers and despise everybody else." From this point on, emperors will mostly gain power by brute force. And internal and external problems will multiply in the Roman Empire. The empire has now begun what will be a long, mostly downhill slide. And what's interesting is that even the Romans who lived at the time recognized this. So, for example, when writing about the death of the last of the five good emperors, a Roman historian, Cassius Dio, wrote, "Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust." And that's an assessment that most modern historians pretty much agree with. Having surveyed the rise of the Roman Empire, I would now like to pause in the historical narrative to consider some key aspects of ancient empires in general, and particularly how Rome compares to the Chinese Empire. So we'll look at that in the next couple lectures. Thank you.